You have more money than years left to spend it, my sister said as she pushed a pen toward me on Christmas night. The room went so quiet that I could hear the old clock above the fireplace counting each second. Diane sat across from me at the dining table, wearing the red velvet dress she had chosen for our family dinner and the calm expression of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. Beside her, my son Michael stared at his folded hands. His wife Lauren stood near the doorway with her arms crossed. No one looked surprised. That was when I understood that the silver box beneath my Christmas tree had never been a gift. 20 minutes earlier, Diane had carried it into the dining room after we finished opening presents. The ribbon was tied neatly, and a small card on top said that family should always share good fortune. I expected an old photograph, perhaps something that had belonged to our mother. Instead, I found a thick stack of legal papers with yellow tabs marking the places where I was supposed to sign. The first page named a new family trust. The second listed Diane as the person who would control it. The amount printed near the top was $9 million. My $9 million. The money my late husband Thomas and I had spent more than 30 years building through our home healthcare company. Diane tapped the papers with one polished fingernail. "This is the fair solution," she said. "You keep talking about protecting the family. Now you can prove you mean it." Michael finally looked at me. "Mom, Aunt Diane has a plan that benefits everyone." Lauren stepped forward and placed the pen beside my dessert plate. The pecan pie I had baked that morning sat untouched in front of me. A small drop of melted vanilla ice cream slid toward the edge, slow and silent. I did not pick up the pen. "What exactly am I giving her?" I asked. Diane smiled as if I were a child asking an unnecessary question. "You are not giving me anything. You are putting the money where it can help the entire family." She explained that she would pay off her business debts, reopen her event center, help Michael expand his consulting firm, and make sure the grandchildren had secure futures. She spoke quickly, listing promises that all depended on one thing: complete control of everything Thomas and I had earned. I turned to Michael. "Did you know she was bringing these papers?" His jaw tightened. We all discussed it. The words landed more heavily than Diane's demand. My son had not arrived for Christmas dinner and discovered a family dispute. He had helped prepare one. Lauren said I lived alone in a house that was too large and kept more money than I could possibly need. Diane added that at 68, I should be thinking about legacy instead of control. I looked around the table I had set with my best china. I had cooked for 2 days. I had wrapped every present myself. Red candles glowed between evergreen branches, and Thomas's empty chair remained at the far end, just as it had since he died. They had chosen Christmas because they believed the decorations, the memories, and the fear of losing family would make me easier to pressure. Michael pushed the pen closer. "We should finish this tonight," he said. "The bank opens tomorrow morning." I rested my fingertips on the first page, but did not turn it. "How long have you been planning this?" No one answered. Diane's smile weakened. Lauren looked toward Michael. He looked toward the window. Their silence told me more than any confession could have. I picked up the pen, and every face around the table relaxed. Then I used it to circle Diane's name at the top of the trust. "Before I sign," I said, "I want you to explain every power this gives you." Diane leaned back in her chair. "There is no need to read every page, Eleanor. The family has already decided." I placed the pen beside my plate and smiled. They thought the decision had been made. They had not yet realized that they had just given me the first piece of evidence. 7 days earlier, Diane had called while I was sorting Christmas cards at the kitchen table. Her voice was brighter than usual, almost rehearsed. She asked whether dinner would still begin at 5, whether Michael and Lauren were coming, and whether I planned to serve dessert in the dining room. None of those questions seemed strange by themselves. Then she asked whether I kept my identification in the desk near the front hall. I stopped writing and looked toward the hallway. Why would you need to know that? I asked. Diane laughed softly and said she was helping me prepare for an appointment after Christmas. I reminded her that I had not scheduled one. She changed the subject and asked whether my bank opened on December 26th. That was the first moment I felt something shift. It was not fear. It was recognition. For several weeks, conversations that should have been about family had kept drifting toward money. Michael had asked whether I still used the same wealth management firm. Lauren had mentioned that older adults sometimes forgot to update their beneficiaries. Diane had offered to organize my financial records, even though I had never asked for help. Each question arrived wrapped in concern. Together, they sounded like preparation. 2 days later, Michael came by with a poinsettia and a bottle of sparkling cider. He placed them on the counter, then wandered through the house while I made coffee. When I returned from the pantry, he was standing near the desk where I kept household files. He said he was looking for a charger. There was no charger in that drawer. He closed it quickly and smiled in the same way he had as a boy when he hoped charm would erase a lie. I said nothing. After he left, I checked the folders. Nothing appeared missing, but several papers had been moved. A statement from my investment account was no longer beneath the insurance documents. A letter from Harold Stein, my attorney, had been turned face up. The first page of my will sat slightly crooked inside its folder. I straightened each item and locked the desk. Then I walked into the dining room and looked at the small security camera mounted above the bookcase. Thomas had installed the system after a break-in occurred 2 streets away. I rarely checked it. That afternoon, I opened the application and confirmed that the camera covered the dining table, the doorway, and the area beneath the Christmas tree. I changed the password and turned on automatic cloud storage. I did not know exactly what my family intended to discuss, but I wanted a record of it. The day before Christmas Eve, Lauren called and asked whether Sophie would be allowed to leave the table after dinner. She said the adults needed privacy for a serious family decision. I asked what decision she meant. She paused, then said Diane would explain everything. Should I prepare anything? I asked. Lauren answered too quickly. Just bring your driver's license. I was standing in my own kitchen. There was nowhere for me to bring it. I let the silence remain until she corrected herself and said I should keep it nearby. That evening, I called Harold. I did not tell him anyone had committed a crime because I did not know that. I only described the questions, the moved papers, and the sudden interest in my bank schedule. He advised me not to sign anything without independent review. He also asked me to photograph every document presented to me and keep the originals if possible. Before ending the call, he said something Thomas used to tell me during difficult negotiations. Let them believe silence means agreement. On Christmas morning, I set the table with red candles and evergreen branches. I prepared the meal exactly as planned. I wrapped gifts, chilled the cider, and placed Thomas's photograph on the mantel. I also checked the camera one final time. The light was steady. The storage was active. At 4:45, Diane arrived carrying the silver box. Michael and Lauren came 10 minutes later. Neither asked what was inside it. They already knew. I greeted them warmly, took their coats, and watched the box disappear beneath the tree. By the time we sat down for dinner, I understood that the meeting had begun long before anyone mentioned money. I simply did not yet know how much of my life they intended to place inside Diane's hands. The $9 million had not appeared because of luck, inheritance, or some sudden deal made in a glass office. Thomas and I had built it one careful year at a time. We began with a rented space that measured less than 500 square feet above a pharmacy on the west side of Columbus. The carpet was worn, the heating system worked only when it wanted to, and our First desk had belonged to Thomas's uncle. We called the company Brooks Home Health Services because we believed older people deserved to recover in familiar rooms instead of feeling forgotten somewhere far from home. In the beginning, Thomas visited clients while I handled schedules, payroll, insurance forms, and every phone call that came through the single line on our desk. We could not afford a receptionist. We could barely afford ourselves. I packed sandwiches for lunch and kept a jar of instant coffee beside the filing cabinet. When an employee called in sick, I found a replacement. When an insurance claim was denied, I spent hours gathering records and filing appeals. When families could not understand the paperwork, I sat with them until they did. There were years when Thomas and I paid our staff before paying ourselves. Once, during a difficult winter, we borrowed against our house to keep the company open. Diane knew that. She had watched me cancel vacations, wear the same coat for 8 seasons, and work through holidays while she told relatives that Thomas and I were obsessed with business. She never asked whether we were afraid of losing everything. She only asked whether we had started making money yet. The company grew slowly. 1 nurse became 5. 5 became 20. We moved into a larger office, then opened 2 additional locations. Thomas built trust with physicians and hospitals. I built the systems that kept the business running. By the time Michael entered high school, we employed more than 80 people across Central Ohio. We paid for his college without loans. We helped Diane twice when her own business plans failed. The first time, she opened a gift shop that closed after 14 months. The second time, she invested in a banquet hall with a partner who left before the first year ended. Thomas and I covered part of her debt because our mother asked us to keep peace in the family. Diane promised she would repay us. She never did. I never mentioned it at Christmas dinners. I never used it to shame her. I told myself sisters should not keep score. After Thomas became ill, he continued working as long as he could. I drove him to appointments in the morning, returned to the office in the afternoon, and reviewed financial reports beside his bed at night. When he died, several buyers approached me within weeks. They assumed grief would make me eager to sell. One offered less than half the company's true value and spoke to me as though Thomas had made every important decision alone. I thanked him for his time and ended the meeting. For nearly a year, I studied valuations, reviewed contracts, and negotiated with 3 different firms. Harold sat beside me during the legal discussions, but every final decision was mine. When the sale closed, the amount remaining after taxes, employee obligations, and business expenses was just under $9 million. I did not celebrate with champagne. I went home, placed Thomas's watch on the kitchen table, and cried because he should have been there. The money represented decades of mornings before sunrise, unpaid weekends, difficult choices, and a marriage built through work as much as love. It was not a family prize waiting to be divided by the loudest person at the table. It was the final chapter of a life Thomas and I had written together. That was what Diane ignored when she placed those papers in front of me. She saw a number. Michael saw an inheritance arriving early. Lauren saw security she had not earned. I saw every employee whose paycheck had cleared because I delayed mine. I saw Thomas asleep in a chair beside a stack of reports. I saw the first office, the broken heater, and the jar of instant coffee. When Diane said I had more money than years left to spend it, she was not asking me to share. She was erasing the years it had taken to build. Back at the Christmas table, Diane watched me as though my silence confirmed her victory. The candles had burned lower, and the room smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and the pine branches I had arranged that morning. Sophie sat near the far end of the table with her hands folded in her lap. She had not spoken since the silver box was opened. Michael shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. "Mom, no one is trying to take anything from you," he said. We are trying to protect the future of this family. I looked at the papers in front of me. By placing everything under Diane's control? Lauren answered before he could. Someone has to manage it responsibly. The word responsibly hung between us. For 30 years, I had managed payroll, taxes, contracts, and the livelihoods of more than 80 employees. Yet in my own dining room, people who had never built a company were explaining responsibility to me. Diane leaned forward and softened her voice. Eleanor, you live alone. You do not travel. You do not spend much. What are you saving all of this for? I glanced toward Thomas's empty chair. That is my decision. Her expression tightened. She said the money could rescue her event center, help Michael expand his consulting business, and give Sophie a better start in life. Each promise sounded generous until I noticed that none of them required Diane to risk anything of her own. Michael said his consulting firm had reached a point where one large investment could change everything. Lauren added that they had delayed renovating their home because they believed family resources should be used wisely. I almost admired the phrase, family resources. My money had already been renamed. Diane began recounting every sacrifice she claimed to have made for us. She reminded everyone that she had stayed with our mother during the final months of her life. She did not mention that I had paid for the nursing assistants, medical equipment, groceries, and repairs to the house. She said she had supported me when Thomas was ill. I remembered 2 short visits and 1 casserole purchased from a grocery store. She said she had always celebrated my success without jealousy. I remember her leaving the company anniversary dinner before dessert because a former classmate had praised my work. I did not correct her. I let the camera record every version of the past she invented. Lauren said keeping $9 million while relatives struggled was selfish. Michael said Thomas had believed in sharing with family. That was the first time anyone used my husband's memory as leverage. I placed my napkin beside my plate. Your father believed in helping people who told the truth, I said. Michael's face changed. Only slightly. It was enough. Diane tapped the trust document again. This is not about old grievances. It is about what makes sense now. I turned to the 7th page, the one I had asked her to explain. A paragraph near the bottom gave the trustee authority to borrow against assets held in the trust. I asked what that meant. Diane said it was standard language. Asked whether she could use my investments as security for a business loan. She told me not to get lost in legal terminology. Lauren said Harold had probably filled my head with unnecessary suspicion. I had not told anyone that I had spoken with him. Their knowledge of that conversation confirmed that someone had searched more than my desk. Michael pushed his chair back and walked to the dining room door. He closed it quietly. We are not leaving until this is settled, he said. No one raised a voice, but the meaning was clear. They intended to keep applying pressure until exhaustion did what persuasion could not. I looked at Sophie. Her eyes met mine for one brief second before dropping to the table.
She knew something.
Diane resumed speaking, describing the trust as a gift to future generations. I turned another page. The document allowed the trustee to sell real estate, limit distributions, and collect management fees. My home was listed among the assets to be transferred. I touched the line with one finger. You included my house. Diane exhaled impatiently. Only so everything is organized. And if I want to sell it, you would ask me first. That answer quieted the room more effectively than any argument. They did not want me to share my fortune. They wanted me to surrender the authority to make decisions about my own life. I closed the document and slid it back into the silver box. Then I smiled at my sister. You have given me a great deal to consider, I said. Diane relaxed again. Michael opened the dining room door. Lauren reached for the coffee pot, as though the evening had returned to normal. They believed I needed time to accept their plan. What I needed was time to discover how far it had already gone. The house became quiet shortly after 10. Diane left the silver box on my dining table, certain that I would spend the night convincing myself to surrender. Michael hugged me before leaving, but the gesture felt rehearsed. Lauren reminded me that the bank appointment was scheduled for 9 the next morning. Sophie lingered near the front door as though she wanted to speak, but Diane called her name from the driveway, and she followed the others into the cold. I locked the door, turned off the porch light, and returned to the dining room. The candles had burned down to uneven pools of red wax. Half a slice of pecan pie remained on Michael's plate. The pen they had placed beside me was still there. I carried the silver box into Thomas's study and set it beneath the brass lamp on his desk. Then I began reading every page. The language was dense, but I had spent decades reviewing contracts. I knew how important decisions could hide inside ordinary sentences. The first section transferred my investment accounts, savings, business proceeds, and home into the new trust. Diane would serve as the sole trustee. I would be listed as the beneficiary, but only while I was alive. At first glance, that arrangement might have sounded protective. The next pages revealed what protection meant to my sister. Diane could decide how much money I received each month. She could delay or deny a withdrawal if she considered it unnecessary. She could move investments without consulting me, borrow against the trust, and use trust assets as collateral for approved business purposes. The document did not define who approved those purposes. Diane did. I turned to the section concerning compensation. She would receive an annual management fee based on the total value of the assets. At $9 million, that fee would exceed what many families earned in a year. Additional fees could be charged for administrative work, travel, and outside consultation. She could hire her own event company to provide services to the trust and approve payment to herself. The arrangement was not designed to rescue her business once. It was designed to make my life finance it indefinitely. My home appeared in a separate schedule of property. Diane would have authority to sell it if she determined that maintaining it was not financially practical. She could move me to another residence, pay the expenses from my own money, and describe the decision as responsible management. I picture her walking through my rooms, deciding which memories were worth the cost of keeping. Thomas's study, the kitchen where we planned our first expansion, the dining room where my family had just tried to take control of everything. One paragraph stated that disputes regarding distributions would be resolved by a financial advisor selected by the trustee. Diane would choose the person who decided whether Diane's decisions were fair. Another clause allowed her to appoint a replacement trustee without my approval. Lauren's name appeared as the first suggested successor. Michael's name appeared as a witness on the final page. His signature was dated 6 days before Christmas. I rested my hand against the desk and studied it. He had signed before Diane ever placed the box under my tree. He had looked through my records, watched me prepare dinner, and allowed me to believe we were gathering as a family. Near the back, I found a proposed letter addressed to my bank. It instructed the Wealth Management Department to transfer my accounts immediately after receiving the signed agreement. My account numbers were already typed into the document. So were the approximate balances. Diane could not have obtained those numbers by guessing. Someone had copied them from my private statements. I photographed every page, then saved the images in 2 separate locations. I placed the originals back in order and returned them to the silver box. Before closing it, I removed the pen from my pocket and wrote the date and time on a blank sheet. Underneath, I listed the powers Diane expected me to surrender. My accounts, my home, my income, my decisions, my independence. The truth looked simpler without legal language. They had not prepared a generous family trust. They had prepared a system in which I would ask my sister for permission to use my own life. At 11:43, My phone lit up with a message from Sophie. It contained only 6 words. Grandma, they have more documents too. My hands remained still above the phone. Sophie had never sent me a message that late unless something was wrong. I typed back and asked whether she was safe. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then returned. She wrote that she was in her room and that her parents thought she was asleep. A photograph arrived next. It showed a stack of papers spread across Michael's desk. I enlarged the image and recognized the first page of my will, 2 investment statements, a letter from Harold, and a copy of the appraisal for my house. Another photograph followed. This one showed a family group conversation with Diane, Michael, and Lauren. Sophie had captured the messages before her mother removed her from the group. Diane wrote that I would resist at first, but would give in if everyone stayed united. Lauren replied that Christmas was the perfect time because I hated conflict during family gatherings. Michael wrote that he would bring copies of the account balances and make sure the bank appointment was ready. I read his words twice. My sister had designed the plan, but my son had supplied the map. Sophie sent more images. In one message, Diane complained that I still treated the $9 million as if Thomas and I had earned it alone. She said family wealth belonged to the family. Lauren suggested telling me that transferring control would protect me from fraud. Then she added that if I refused, they could begin documenting signs that I was no longer making sound financial decisions. The phrase looked clinical and harmless until I understood what she meant. They intended to use my age against me. Diane answered that a few stories about forgotten appointments or misplaced paperwork might be enough to persuade others that I needed help. Michael did not object. He asked whether Harold could block them. Diane replied that once I signed the trust, Harold would have no authority to interfere unless I hired him again, and she planned to limit my access to legal expenses. My own money would be used to prevent me from challenging the people controlling it. I set the phone down and looked around Thomas's study. Every object in the room had been chosen by one of us. The walnut shelves, the green reading lamp, the framed photograph of Michael at his college graduation. I had kept that picture on the wall because it reminded me of the day Thomas whispered that every sacrifice had been worth it. Now the son in that photograph had copied my private records and helped build a case against my judgment. Another message arrived from Sophie. She apologized for going through her father's desk. She said she had overheard Diane and Lauren talking after dinner and became frightened when they mentioned taking me to a doctor if the bank meeting failed. I told her she had done the right thing by telling me, but she should not take any more risks or confront anyone. I asked her to send the images to a secure email address Harold had given me for confidential documents. She did so within minutes. Then I asked whether she knew where Michael had obtained the statements. Sophie wrote that he had photographed them during recent visits to my house. She had seen the pictures on his phone. That explained the moved folders and the pages turned out of place. He had not been searching for a charger. He had been collecting information. I saved every message and sent copies to Harold. Although it was after midnight, he replied within 10 minutes. He told me not to attend the bank meeting alone and not to sign, initial, or verbally approve anything. He asked whether I wanted him to contact the bank before it opened. I said yes. Then I made one more decision. I called Diane. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding sleepy and irritated. I told her I had reviewed the trust and was prepared to discuss the transfer at the bank in the morning. Her voice changed immediately. Warmth returned. She said she knew I would eventually understand what was best. I asked her to bring every document, including anything related to my capacity, the house, and the investment accounts. There was a brief silence. Then she said everything would be explained at the meeting. I thanked her and ended the call. She believed I had surrendered. By morning, the bank would know otherwise. By 7:30 the next morning, I was sitting across from Harold in his office with the silver box on the table between us. The city outside was still gray from the winter dawn, and the sidewalks below were nearly empty. Harold read the trust in silence, turning each page slowly and marking sections with a yellow legal pad beside him. When he reached Michael's signature, he removed his glasses and looked at me. "Did your son explain why he signed this?" he asked. I told him Michael had not explained anything. Harold continued reading until he reached the clauses concerning my home, legal expenses, and Diane's authority to determine my monthly distributions. His expression remained controlled, but his pen stopped moving. "This is not a family gift agreement," he said. "It is a transfer of control." I handed him the photographs Sophie had sent and the messages describing their plan to question my ability to manage my affairs. He read those twice. Then he called Caleb Morrison, the senior wealth manager who had handled my accounts since the sale of the company. Caleb arrived 20 minutes later carrying a laptop and a folder of account forms. I had known him for years, but he asked me several careful questions before discussing any changes. He wanted to hear directly from me that I understood the value of my assets, the purpose of the meeting, and the consequences of refusing the proposed trust. I answered each question clearly. I gave him the current balances, described how the company's sale had been structured, and explained every power Diane expected me to surrender. Caleb nodded once. "That is enough for me," he said. We began protecting the accounts. Michael's name was removed as an emergency financial contact. Any prior authorization connected to him was canceled. New security questions were added, along with a verbal password known only to me. Caleb placed a special notice on every account stating that no transfer, trustee change, or third-party access request could be approved without my direct confirmation and Harold's presence. He also documented that I had reported attempted emotional pressure involving a proposed transfer of assets. The words looked formal on the screen. The experience had not felt formal in my dining room. It had felt like my family closing a door and placing a pen in front of me. Harold prepared a statement confirming that I had received independent legal advice and rejected the trust Diane had brought. He also drafted new instructions for Sophie's education fund. The money would remain protected for tuition, housing, books, and approved educational expenses, but neither Michael nor Lauren would be able to withdraw from it or borrow against it. A neutral corporate trustee would manage the fund until Sophie reached the age specified in the agreement. I was not punishing my granddaughter for the choices of her parents. I was making sure their choices could not reach what belonged to her future. Before leaving Harold's office, I opened the security application on my phone. The entire Christmas dinner had been recorded. The camera showed Diane placing the papers before me, Lauren pushing the pen across the table, Michael closing the dining room door, and each of them insisting that the family had already decided. Their voices were clear. Harold downloaded a copy to his secure files. I saved another to an external drive and placed it in my purse. By 8:45, every practical step was complete. Diane believed I was preparing to hand her $9 million. In reality, the money had never been more secure. Harold asked whether I still wanted to attend the bank meeting. I did. Canceling would allow Diane to tell the family that I had become confused or frightened. I wanted her to explain the trust in front of people who understood exactly what it did. I wanted Michael to hear his own choices described without the protection of Christmas music and family language. At 8:58, Diane sent me a message asking whether I was on my way. I replied that I would be there shortly. She answered with a red heart and wrote that she was proud of me for finally putting family first. Harold read the message over my shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked. I placed the silver box back beneath its lid and carried it toward the elevator. "Yes," I said. "They wanted me at the bank. I intend to let them finish asking." Diane was already seated in the bank's conference room when Harold and I
arrived.
Michael sat beside her, and Lauren occupied the chair nearest the door. A small bottle of champagne rested inside a gift bag near Diane's feet. She had brought it to celebrate. The confidence on her face changed when she saw Harold carrying the silver box. Caleb stood at the head of the table and introduced himself, although everyone except Diane had met him before. She said there was no need for formalities because the family had reached an agreement. Eleanor is transferring her assets into a trust today, she announced. Caleb looked at me instead of her. Is that what you want, Mrs. Brooks? I placed my purse on the table and sat down. I want my sister to explain exactly what she expects me to sign. Diane gave a patient smile. She opened the box, removed the documents, and slid them toward Caleb. She described the arrangement as a family protection plan. She said I would remain the beneficiary and that she would simply manage the money more efficiently. Harold asked what would happen if I wanted to withdraw a large amount. Diane said she would review the request. He asked whether she could deny it. She paused, then said only if the withdrawal was irresponsible. Who decides what is irresponsible? Harold asked. Diane looked down at the document. The trustee.
Which would be you, he said.
Michael shifted in his chair. Lauren folded her arms. Caleb asked about the management fee. Diane said it was standard compensation for the time she would spend overseeing the trust. Harold read the percentage aloud and calculated the first year's payment. The number was larger than the annual salary of many of my former employees. Diane said the work would be demanding. Caleb then asked why the agreement allowed her to borrow against the assets for business purposes. She answered that flexibility was important. Could you use the trust as collateral for your event center? I asked. Her eyes moved toward Michael. Only if it benefited the family. Harold turned to the section concerning my home. Could you sell Mrs. Brooks's residence without her approval? Diane said she would never do that unless maintaining the property became impractical. Could you do it? He repeated. This time, she did not answer. The room grew still. Michael leaned toward me and said we were making a simple family matter sound suspicious. I removed the external drive from my purse and placed it beside the silver box. Harold opened his laptop and played the recording from Christmas night. Diane's voice filled the room, telling me I had more money than years left to spend it. Lauren appeared, pushing the pen toward my plate. Michael closed the dining room door and said no one was leaving until the matter was settled. Diane stared at the screen. You recorded us? She asked. My security system recorded what happened in my home, I said. Harold then displayed the messages Sophie had preserved. Diane's plan to pressure me. Lauren's suggestion that they question my judgment. Michael's promise to bring my account balances. My son's face lost its color when his messages appeared on the screen. He said the conversation had been taken out of context. Caleb closed the trust document. This institution will not process this transfer, he said. Mrs. Brooks has declined it after receiving independent legal advice. Her accounts are also protected against third-party access. Diane turned toward me. You told me you agreed. I agreed to attend the meeting, I said. I never agreed to surrender my life. Harold handed Michael a written notice confirming that he was no longer my emergency financial contact. Then he placed a second document before me. It protected Sophie's education fund under an independent trustee. I signed it with the same pen Diane had placed beside my dessert plate. Michael asked whether I was removing him from my estate. I told him my estate plan was private and would remain that way. Lauren said I was dividing the family over money.
No, irraplia.
The money revealed a division that was already here. Diane reached for the trust papers, but Caleb gathered them first and returned them in the silver box. The champagne remained unopened beside her chair. When the meeting ended, They left without looking back. I stayed long enough to confirm every security change with Caleb. For the first time since Christmas dinner, no one was asking me to prove that I loved them. They had finally been required to prove that they respected me, and the documents on the table had already given their answer. The first weeks after the bank meeting were quieter than I expected. Diane sent 3 messages accusing me of humiliating her. Lauren wrote that I had damaged Michael's relationship with his aunt. Michael said nothing at all. I forwarded every message to Harold and answered none of them. For most of my life, silence had been something I used to keep peace. This time, it became the space where I learned what peace actually felt like. Diane's event center closed before spring. Without access to my assets, she could not refinance the debt or secure another large loan. She sold the building, paid what she could, and moved into a smaller home outside the city. I did not celebrate her loss. I simply stopped preventing the consequences of choices that were never mine. Michael contacted me in March. His first message was short. He wrote that he wanted to apologize without asking for money. I waited 2 days before replying. We met at a quiet coffee shop near the old company office. He looked tired and older than 43. He admitted that he had photographed my financial papers and shared them with Diane. He said he had convinced himself that the trust would eventually benefit everyone, including me. "You knew I did not want it," I said. He looked down at his coffee. "I thought you would forgive me afterward." That answer told me how often forgiveness had become part of his planning. I told him trust would not return because he was ashamed. It would return only if his behavior changed when there was nothing to gain. After that, we spoke once every few weeks. No business proposals. No questions about my will. No requests for help with bills. He began repaying a small loan Thomas and I had given him years earlier, even though I had never demanded it. The payments were modest, but each one arrived on time. Lauren did not apologize. Diane did not either. I accepted that remorse could not be negotiated any more than love could. Sophie remained close to me. Her education fund was placed under the independent management Caleb had arranged, and she received direct information about how it worked. Neither parent could borrow from it, redirect it, or use it as collateral. When she was accepted to a university in Ohio, she brought the letter to my house and opened it at the same dining table where the silver box had once rested.
She cried.
I did too. Not because of the money, but because her future no longer depended on anyone's promise. As the next Christmas approached, I considered leaving the dining room untouched. For years, I had believed tradition mattered because it kept a family connected. The previous Christmas had shown me that a full table could still be lonely. Then Sophie asked whether we could have dinner at my house. She wanted to invite Harold, Caleb, Nora from next door, and 3 former employees from Brooks Home Health Services who had become close friends. I agreed. On Christmas morning, I set out the same china and arranged evergreen branches around red candles. This time, I did not place legal papers beneath the tree. I placed photographs from the early years of the company, including one of Thomas standing beside our first office sign. By 5 o'clock, the house was filled with voices that did not lower when I entered the room. No one asked about account balances. No one discussed what I should do with my home. Harold brought a pie. Caleb carried sparkling cider. Sophie helped serve dinner and told stories about her plans for college. One chair remained empty near the end of the table. It had once belonged to Diane. I noticed it, but I did not feel the old fear of absence. An empty chair was honest. It did not pretend affection while waiting for a signature. After dessert, Michael arrived alone. He had asked permission earlier that week, and I had told him he could come if he understood that the evening would not include financial discussions. He brought no papers and no expectations. He placed a small framed photograph of Thomas and me beneath the tree and said he hoped one day I would trust him again. One day is built from many ordinary days, I told him. He nodded and joined the others at the table. Nothing was repaired all at once. That was not what healing looked like. Healing was a locked file drawer, a protected education fund, a son learning that access was not love, a sister finally responsible for her own life. Later, when the guests had gone and Sophie was helping me collect the plates, I looked at the empty chair one final time. Diane had believed Christmas would make me afraid of being alone. Instead, it showed me who had only remained close because they expected my money to keep the seat warm.